I'm standing on a bridge that's going over the Piscataqua River. I'm right in between New Hampshire and Maine, and I am looking out at this water, and I am just amazed at how much water there is, and I'm wondering, where did all this water come from? Do you ever wonder that? Where did this river begin? Pause the video now and talk to a parent or a partner, or write down your ideas about where you think all this water came from and where do rivers begin. So pause the video now and talk about it. I'll bet you had some great ideas about where all of this water comes from. There are around 30 rivers that flow into the Piscataqua River, and there are hundreds of smaller brooks and streams that flow into those rivers. In addition to all the fresh water that flows from those rivers each day, twice a day the tides bring in a steady flow of salty water directly from the ocean. When we are here in Portsmouth, we are just a few miles away from the Gulf of Maine, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, Newcastle Beach and Odioran Point, where you may have spent time at the beach or gone tide pooling, are just a few miles away from here. When the tides bring in the salty water from the ocean, it travels up the Piscataqua River and eventually heads into the Great Bay Estuary and even up part of the Oyster River, as well as some of the other local rivers. When the tide goes out again, the water flows back out towards the Piscataqua River and then back out in the direction of the ocean. In order to understand where this river begins, we are going to explore one small brook that starts right in Durham and then flows to the UNH campus and then eventually flows out in this direction. You may know the brook I'm thinking of. It is called the College Brook. So now we will travel about 10 miles back to Durham to explore and think about the question, where do rivers begin? I'm right up by the dairy barn in Durham, kind of near the highway and right along a road, and I am interested in understanding where the College Brook begins, and I'd like to trace the water that's right here in this little side of the road here. This is the beginning of the College Brook. I'd like to trace it from here all the way down where it enters the College Brook that's right by the bagel shop, the Hannaford, and then trace it into the mill pond and then into Oyster River. So I'm out here on this very rainy day, seeing how this is really filling up with water and how that's going to travel down to the brook. So we found the beginning of the College Brook, which is right next to a road, and also it travels along the side of a cow farm. You might start to think about how what is happening on the land next to a brook or stream might affect the health or quality of the water in the stream. I see that the brook continues down the road, and I'm going to follow it a few hundred feet where I see it travels underneath the road and out across to another field. You can see the cow barns in the distance and the water flowing through this field. And it's a very, very rainy day. So there's a lot of water flow right now. And it's traveling through the field. And then it's going under this road, 155, by this culvert. So there's cars going by and the water's flowing underneath and then traveling towards campus. Now I've crossed the road. And I'm kind of looking at the brook. You can kind of see that path going through this field. The water's traveling down towards campus right now. Now I am right by the entrance to the College Woods, and I'm looking at the UNH football field. The brook has come from the field next to the road. It has traveled underneath the soccer field, and now we can see it flowing alongside the College Woods, where it is entering a culvert where it will flow underground, under the road and railroad tracks, and through part of campus. After traveling underground through part of campus, the College Brook is above ground again, and we can see it flowing right next to the MUB on campus. There are walkways nearby that students use to get to their classes. You might want to think about how this brook might be different than a mountain brook or stream, and how the activities of the campus might affect the quality of the water. After it passes the MUB, it goes underneath the road and travels underground again under a large parking lot as it heads toward the Mill Road Plaza. And now, finally, the College Brook is above ground again, right next to the Mill Road Shopping Plaza in Durham. This is a plaza with a large parking lot with stores and restaurants that I'm sure you recognize. The brook is located on the side of the parking lot that is opposite from these stores, and you might look for it sometime when you come here with your family. Think about how this parking lot and all these businesses might affect the College Brook. I also wanted to show you how different this area looked many, many years ago, when there was a farm on this land before these stores were built. Here are some pictures of the Chesley family farmhouse and barn that was located in this spot. The Chesley family owned this land and farmed it before the land was purchased 50 years ago to become a shopping plaza. The College Brook used to flow right through the field behind their house, and now it flows through this business section of the town of Durham. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was able to talk with one of the scientists who monitors or checks on the College Brook. His name is Professor Wollheim, and he told me a lot about what he and other scientists are doing as they ask questions and plan investigations to learn more about the College Brook. As always, once I come up with one question, how did all the water get to the Piscataqua River, I always am led to other questions. Does that happen to you? What I am wondering now is, how do scientists tell how healthy a stream, brook, or river is? And why do we care about this, especially with something as small as this brook?
So I'm standing here at College Brook, a very small stream that flows down a little bit further and where it enters into Mill Pond and it joins the Oyster River. And I try to understand the nutrients that flow through here, because the nutrients that get down to the estuary could cause some problems. And so I'm trying to understand what people do in their watershed changes that, and then also how do the streams and rivers respond, and to some degree how do the streams and rivers actually help us by removing some of the excess nutrients. So basically I study the health of streams and rivers, sort of like a doctor that has their instruments. For example, here I have a meter that helps me to measure the water quality here in College Brook. I have other sorts of sensors that we can put in the river that stay there all the time and measure every 15 minutes or something like that. And so it's important to be able to sort of understand how land use change and the weather, how that interacts with the weather to influence the health of the streams and the rivers. So as an example, one of the things, College Brook here is actually one of the most polluted streams in New Hampshire. It has a lot of salt in it. Where do you think the salt comes from? It comes from the roads. It comes from winter, when we put salt on the roads to help melt the snow and ice. But the water quality is actually pretty bad here in the summer as well, even though we put that salt on the road in the winter. And that's because a lot of it gets into the groundwater, which then takes some time to flow into the stream and the river. So we have these meters we can put in. We just put this in. We can measure just like that. We can see how salty it is. And basically, although this is not like the ocean, it's sort of on the continuum, sort of like an estuary where it mixes freshwater and saltwater. So this we can measure just whenever we come to visit the stream. It doesn't really help us much if we want to know what happens in the middle of the night or in the middle of a storm. So that's why we put these things into streams and rivers these days, because we can leave them there. And they can measure all the time, even when we're not visiting the stream. So if you can see, there's a tube down there. There are instruments like this that measure water depth, so we know if it's a storm. We measure this with this particular meter, so we can see how all that changes during the year, during different storm events. So basically it's like doctor, either you go once a year or you can also measure sort of your heart rate continuously, like with your Apple Watch or something like that. We study streams and rivers. They're actually very dynamic because of storms, because whenever you have a rain event, this flow goes up and down. And so they're always kind of these ecosystems that are constantly recovering from some kind of changing conditions. The problem with urbanization, you know, like the parking lot here or the buildings, is that too much water gets into that stream and river, more than is supposed to. And so that disturbance is even stronger in an urban stream compared to a forested stream. And so what we're trying to understand in my lab is, using instruments like this, is how different are these streams and rivers, and maybe, hopefully, what can we do to keep them from changing too much so that they become something different than what they really are. So some things that change when you have a big storm in here is you could scour the algae that's maybe growing in there so that there's less primary production, which is the food source for a lot of the invertebrates in here. You can also see a lot of leaves this time of year from the leaves that fall in from, you can see them falling right now. These provide a lot of energy as well for the stream, for the ecosystem in there. For one of my classes, we study decomposition rates. We put litter bags into the stream to see how long do they stay. And towards the end of these experiments, there's all kinds of bugs and things living on them, chewing on the leaves. Basically like what happens in your compost pile.
How do you know the difference? That sounds like a great study. How do you know the difference? Do you weigh the leaves before you put them in, and then? Yeah,
we put them in a screen. We weigh the leaves before. We put those leaves in a screen, seal it up, put it in the river, and come back in a week. And then we have 4 different bags so that we can compare the initial and week 1, initial week 2, initial week 3. So we use experiments to understand how these streams work. The other important part here is that this stream, even though we're standing in one spot, is connected to everything that happens upstream. And it influences a bunch of stuff that happens downstream. So it's part of the whole watershed ecosystem. And so when people change the things that are going on in the watershed, that's going to end up here in the stream. So if you fertilize a lawn, or if you have wastewater from a wastewater treatment plant or a septic system, that's going to end up, if it's not used on your lawn, say the fertilizer is not used on your lawn, that's going to end up here in the stream and river, and it's going to cause changes. And that's something that's called eutrophication potentially. Eutrophication is when there's too much primary production. So when you have a lawn, you put fertilizer on it, it turns the lawn green. That's a good thing. We like that. A lot of people like that. But if not all that fertilizer is used there on the lawn, it gets into the groundwater, eventually into streams, moves down to lakes and estuaries, and it's going to make those greener than they should be, just like your lawn, except that there you don't really want it to happen. And that's what's maybe happening in Great Bay, and that's why the eelgrass that's in Great Bay is not doing so well over the last 10 years or so, because we think that there's too much nitrogen getting in, and that's causing algae to grow on the leaves, or macroalgae, and so you can't, the eelgrass is not healthy anymore. So we do a lot of measurements of the chemistry of the water, how much there is, to understand these connections, how the different parts are connected, and then also what are the processes here in the ecosystem, like the litter decomposition, the nutrient uptake, how much is lost, to understand how these systems are connected.
What watershed are we in right here? If you trace this back, I think you took this out to the bay, kind of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
Yep. So this watershed, and I've walked it many times with my class, with my students, because we measure all the way along here. This is the College Brook watershed, which starts up at the Fairchild Dairy. It then flows through a couple of fields. It flows underneath a soccer field. It flows through College Woods. It then goes under some buildings on campus, under the railroad tracks, comes out behind Spalding Hall, and then flows past the MUB, goes back underground. There's a parking lot on UNH campus just across from the Durham Marketplace that it flows under. and then it comes out here, and for about the last 500 meters or so, it flows down to here. And then it's not too far before you get to the Mill Pond. So this is the whole watershed for College Brook, and you can sort of already try to understand, or you can already imagine, how does the water quality change as you go through these different kinds of land use types. You have agriculture, you have parking lots, you have buildings, you have grass, you have all kinds of different things. It's above ground, below ground. So people have really changed this stream and this river.
So thinking about right here, I'm wondering what's the quality, and then I'm thinking going back further and maybe where it kind of originates.
Yeah.
It's kind of.
So the water quality is pretty bad everywhere.
Okay.
It starts off kind of bad. It gets a little better as it flows through College Woods. And then it gets really bad as it flows through campus. And then it stays bad all the way down to here. So we're in the College Brook watershed. So whenever you stand along a stream, anywhere you are, the area that drains to that point is part of the watershed. So everything that happens in that watershed influences what is occurring here. You can go downstream and you'd be standing along the Oyster River, and you're in the Oyster River watershed, but College Brook watershed is part of the Oyster River watershed. And if you keep going further down, say to Portsmouth, where you're along the Piscataqua, well, you're in the Piscataqua River watershed down there, but the Oyster River watershed is part of that, as is the College Brook watershed. So it's kind of sits within the larger scale. Think of the Russian dolls that they start big and you open them up, there's another doll, and then there's another doll, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller. That's exactly what watersheds are like. And here we're College Brook, which is one of the smallest dolls within the bigger doll.
Awesome.
So the other part of why we do this research, so we're trying to understand scientifically how these ecosystems work, because we want to try to be able to better manage them so that there are fewer problems. And if there are problems, then we can figure out ways to solve those problems. We need to know how these ecosystems work in order to be able to do that. And the research that we do actually also helps the communities that we're in as well. So, for example, I do research here on College Brook, as well as on Mill Pond and in the Oyster River. And there are two decisions that are being made by the community, by Durham here. One is whether to take the Mill Pond dam out, which would turn that reservoir into a stream or into a river. And the other decision that's currently being discussed is how to redevelop the Durham Marketplace area here, which is going to affect the College Brook here as well. So we've been able to share our data with some of the people that are making decisions to help them decide what they want to do. So for Mill Pond, we care about how much nitrogen gets pulled out of Mill Pond, because if you take the dam out and the amount of nitrogen flowing down to Great Bay changes, that could alter the health of Great Bay. Here, if you redevelop the Durham Marketplace, you could change how much flooding occurs down here, because if you change the amount of impervious surfaces, so parking lots or roofs, there's less evaporation, and all that rainfall gets into the stream or the river and causes floods. So where I'm standing right here, you can't really see this here, but this floods regularly. Right now there are leaves. You can see leaves, they've just all fallen. The next time we have a big rain event, this is all going to get swept away, and it's probably going to be cleared. And so the question then for Durham and the Durham Marketplace, for example, is if they put in more parking lot, will that cause this to become even a greater problem? And then people downstream care about it as well. So one of the things we have is our data logger down there in that white tube that measures the water depth continuously. So over the last 6 or 7 years that we've had the data logger in there, we have a continuous record of how often does College Brook flood. And so that's useful information for thinking about how it might change in the future as well.
What's considered a flood?
A flood is when it goes overbank. So
okay.
If it gets up above where there's vegetation, so like above here, that would be considered a flood.
And are there patterns then to when it floods? Is it usually in the spring, or is it a certain month? Or?
Good question. Yes, you're right. So the pattern is usually that it's in the winter and the spring if it's raining as opposed to snowing, that's when you get the worst floods, because the soils get wet. The soils don't dry up as much because there's no evaporation, no transpiration by all the trees. And so all that rain then a lot more rain then gets into the streams and rivers, causing even worse floods than would normally be there. The problem with impervious surfaces.
What are impervious surfaces?
So parking lot.
Okay, so things that you can't penetrate.
Yes.
It's not like
so there's
soil, water can go through it, but okay.
Yeah. So impervious surface is something where there's nothing growing, and it just kind of shoots off.
Now I'm looking at the Hannaford parking lot in Durham, and it's a very, very rainy and windy day, and you can see the water flowing down the parking lot, and it's coming down, and there's some drainage right here, but you can see it's almost like a big puddle. There's a drainage that's heading into the College Brook. So all this water from these impervious surfaces from the parking lot, it doesn't have anywhere to go. It can't soak into a parking lot, so it flows down, and now it's heading into the brook. And now you can see with many hours of rain how this brook, the College Brook, really fills up with water. You can see it's almost at the edge of the bank where it could possibly come over, and that would be called a flood if it was to go over the bank. And you can see all those leaves that were here earlier when Dr. Wollheim was speaking. They've all been flushed down the river, down the brook, and so I've gotten up close to some of these instruments, so you can see that looks like it's just at about 60 here at the brook. So this is getting very high. Some of you might know this bridge that goes over into some of these neighborhoods in Durham, coming right from the Hannaford, the grocery store. And it's pretty exciting to look at this water and how fast it is flowing. So that's coming down through campus and right next to the parking lot here. I walked downstream and watched the water go underneath Mill Pond Road. And right over where those canoes are is the place where the College Brook enters the Mill Pond. And then it flows down into the pond. And once the College Brook meets the Mill Pond, the water eventually flows over the dam and into the Oyster River, where it travels down past Wagon Hill and into Little Bay and into the Great Bay Estuary, home to many important plant and animal species, where it will also flow into the Piscataqua River, which helps us to answer our first question: where did all this water come from? Think about how all of these small brooks, streams, and rivers are interconnected, many smaller ecosystems that are part of a larger ecosystem. If you were to pick one small stream or brook to study, what kinds of questions would you ask? What kinds of investigations would you plan? How would you help to make sure that the animals and plants living downstream would have a safe and healthy place to live?